I'm Allison Cruz here in Amelia County in Jetersville, and I'm for the soil.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and Eric Benfelt and Mary Sketch Bryant will be joining us in just a few moments with a special guest. But I wanted to remind everyone of the blog entries at our website. That's the website forthesoil.org, the digit 4, thesoil.org. And one of our most recent blog entries is about what to do with all those leaves in your front and backyard. You can turn those leaves into topsoil. There's some very good tips there at our website. Just go to forthesoil.org and then click on the blog, and you'll see ways to save the gold and red and brown leaves. And thank you, Sarah, for that blog entry. Well, now let's go to our podcast with a very special guest talking about appropriate technology. It's a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and joining me, we have Eric Benfelt with the Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and also Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And today's podcast is part 2 of our conversation with Lee Rinehart. Lee Rinehart He's a sustainable agriculture specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology and had some very interesting things to say in the previous podcast. You'll want to go back and listen to that one. But right now, we're just resuming that conversation. And we asked Lee about what inspired him or who inspired him to take this career path where he is engaged with organic agriculture, with sustainable agriculture, with soil health. Who inspired Lee to do that?
So I'm going to talk about two people very quickly, but honestly, the first person who was inspirational was Ralph Lee Jobe, the wonderful man whom I was named after. My middle name is Lee, and his middle name was Lee, and he is my maternal grandfather. And Ralph Jobe was a farmer. He was a tradesman. He was a contrarian and a bootlegger, and I loved him dearly. And he had 7 acres up in the East Texas woods and grew an awful lot of the food that I and my family ate whenever I was a kid. And summers up at Pawpaw Jobe's farm were the best. Barefoot, snakes, it was great, right? We had such a good time. So he, I think, put it in my head that I really wanted to do something with farming, but I didn't know what. I went through FFA and all of that, FFA in high school, and I think it's because of him that I really kind of, raised animals and did Future Farmers of American livestock shows and this and that. And so it was only it was only natural that I would go to college and study agriculture. I didn't know that I would be involved with the whole regenerative, sustainable agriculture movement, because that's certainly not what I learned whenever I was at the land grant in Texas. But I read Wendell Berry's Unsettling of America back in the year 2000. And after I read that book, I was shattered. I was undone. I said, this changes my paradigm completely. From now on, I am all about agriculture that is regenerative, both for the land and for the people, right? And I credit that to later in life, Wendell Berry, and earlier in life, Ralph Jobe. Thank you for that question. I love answering it.
Well, I lied, and I do have one more question based on your comment. And this is totally unplanned, but there has been conversation in recent years about the FFA emblem. The plow is a very important part of that emblem in the FFA organization. And there's been discussion that maybe the plow should be retired. maybe there's another image that would be more representative of regenerative agriculture and not disturbing the soil. Do you have any
Uh-huh.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. Thank you. This is the first I've ever heard of this conversation. Um, but I do have some thoughts on it, and I say leave the plow. I say we are bigger than that. We understand what that means. It's I when I look at because when I look at the FFA emblem and I see the plow over the corn and all of that, and the field, to me that brings up history and it brings up a certain feeling, and I'm connected with that. And I don't mind. I don't mind. Keeping that plow there, even though that plow is destructive to the soil. We still cannot live without scratching the soil a little bit. So what we remember, I think what's important is that we're not going to maximize anything. We're not going to go whole hog on any one practice here, right? We're going to optimize. I think, Eric, you said the word optimize earlier, perhaps, but optimize is what we need to do. So we're going to optimize the reduction of tillage. We want to reduce the tillage to our soils as much as possible, but we're still going to have to do some type of scratching. So I would say FFAers, keep your plow symbol, because that is a historic emblem and it's meaningful, but it doesn't mean that we're going to use a moldboard anymore and we're going to plow from fence row to fence row. What it does for me is I look back and I say, wow, I had such a cool time in high school going to livestock shows, and that emblem kind of brings it all back to me. Thank you for asking that question too.
Well, thank you, Lee. And yet, we talk about history, and you read different books and you hear about the dust storms that people experienced in the 1930s, and yet I've had some farmer friends in South Dakota and other areas where significant cloud storms, dust storms, and I think the point that you made too on this, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, the idea that it's a journey and not a destination. And I think the importance of continually learning, and I'd like to hear what you think about the idea of the journey in farming and journey in conservation.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I first of all, I'm kind of like a generalist in a big picture, 30,000 foot view type person. A lot of times people have to call me back down to the ground so I can pay attention to details. And that's why I work so well with teams, right? But so whenever you say journey, I that really resonates with me. And my journey, through agriculture walks a path, and the path comes over to where you and I, Eric, can lock arms for a while and travel that path together, right? And then who knows where it's going to go. But I think the idea of the journey is such a human thing that it really resonates with us. I don't know if I'm exactly going where you are, answering your question exactly like you are expecting, Eric, but to me, it's about a story, right? It's about telling my story. And whenever I'm talking to other farmers, I want to hear their story. And it's those stories, I think, which is why peer-to-peer learning is so hot right now. It's those stories more than anything, I think, that encourage non-adopters to think about a new practice.
Yeah, you shared some of NCAT's resources and where listeners can find those, but what are some of your personal favorite resources right now on soil health?
Yeah, thanks. So we have developed, because of the increase in prices of fuel and fertilizer, we have a toolkit that we've generated. I think we got it online back in May, but we basically wrote a blog And on this blog, we put like a compendium of some of the best things that we had produced over the years to help people think about ways that they can reduce fertilizer expense, right? And kind of wean themselves as much as they can off of synthetic nitrogen because it costs so much. So that's one of my favorite ones. And this one is at attra.org, ATRA. You can go in there and you can go into the blog, or you can actually query, nitrogen fertilizer reduction. It'll bring that toolkit up to you. And it's a really great resource looking at cover crops and compost and manures and, alternative soil amendments and rotations and diversity, and just ways that we know that could help people, help farmers to reduce nitrogen. That's one of my favorites, I think, right now.
And Lee, we've talked about keeping the soil covered, thinking about ways to reduce erosion, but some of the different producers also talk about what are we doing to optimize photosynthesis capture with that? And I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so basically that's just maintaining enough leaf area, right? So especially with grazing, what's I think really important there is maintaining that adequate post-grazing residual, depending upon the type and class of forage plants that you have in the field. Native warm season perennials are gonna, because by the very nature of their bunch grass growth structure, they're going to have to be grazed a lot higher, right? Other grasses can be grazed a little bit lower, and I'm thinking particularly things like Bermuda grass or bluegrass or some of those species. But generally, we want to leave enough leaf area, because what happens? We have the leaf area. It's going to do two things. It's going to capture solar energy, right, after a grazing event, and allow for regrowth and partitioning of carbohydrate, into the roots in order to build it back up so that it can be ready for the winter. But also you create a microclimate whereby at night especially you have carbon dioxide that oozes up from the soil and is actually captured. The more leaf area you have, it's actually captured by the stomas, the little openings on the bottoms of the leaves, and you're actually getting CO2 fertilization there, right? So you got sunlight. Remember, you need water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide, right? And then you can create these simple sugars that become complex parts of the plant and our bodies as well. So keeping enough leaf area, and very important, never go back with your livestock after you have grazed a paddock until those plants have been completely recovered, because then they're ready. And not only that, the nitrogen and carbon, or the nitrogen and carbohydrate balance within that forage sward is a lot more aligned to the gut of the animal who's going to be consuming it.
Yeah. Any other questions, Mary or Eric?
Eric,
one question, Lee, simply because you travel quite a bit. I'm curious about opportunities for interseeding and relay seeding. I think there's different farmers are doing that within corn and other cropping systems. That sort of goes with the idea of capturing photosynthesis and solar energy.
Right. Yep. I think so, because then you've got various structures within the canopy, right? More diversity, I think. All I know is that those who are doing intercropping on a production scale right now are really at the leading edge of something that could be really cool, to take the concepts of diversity and polyculture from the small scale production that we know where it works very well, and we can get lots of calories from a single acre, right, on a small scale polyculture. We don't know how to do it as readily on large scales. We can see yield reductions. Sometimes we see yield increases. Why is that happening? There's a lot we don't know. So I think intercropping, although it's been around a long time, it's still something that is just so regionally significant. There's regional strengths and regional barriers, I think, to those types of systems. And I would like to learn a lot more about how to make those polycultures more appropriate for cropping at scale.
Our time is coming to a close. And once again, we've been talking with Lee Rinehart, Sustainable Agriculture Specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. Lee, where can people learn more about your organization, about projects you're involved with?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I really appreciate that, Jeff. And, we've got several websites, but probably the best one to go to is soilforwater.org. It's all one word, soilforwater, F-O-R, water.org. That is a really good portal. From there, you can learn about the Soil for Water project. You can see the networking in the forum that we have. You can join the forum where you can actually participate in conversations with other practitioners and gardeners and farmers and ranchers all across the country who are doing work to keep water in the soil. And then also you can reach out from there and you can look at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, which is the overall organization that runs these programs, and our flagship ATRA Sustainable Agriculture Technical Assistance Project as well. That's been kind of running since the 80s. A lot of people know us for our ATRA program, where we actually used to take phone calls and talk to people and then put together a packet of print information and snail mail it to you. So that's kind of where we started. And now it's all email and videos and podcasts and things like that. So times have changed.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on our program. Mary, Eric, and Lee, thank you for being on this episode of For the Soil Conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Lee.
And that concludes this episode of For the Soil, a Conversation. It's all made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. All views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. And if you should have a specific question about soil health, contact your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a soil and water conservation district office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a Conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.